Great news, medieval history fans! Feudalism is back, and this time your new kings have all the tools to really push it to its full potential. Maybe you've heard of Techno-feudalism, where our tech overlords control the digital landscape in such a way that everyone becomes entirely dependent on them. Maybe you've also heard of feudalism, a medieval system that had sort of a similar idea, although with some really important differences. In this video, we're going to discuss those differences and find out why this new form of techno-feudalism is actually worse than medieval feudalism, from total exploitation with no safeguards to completely concentrated digital power and even the gradual stripping of your communal identity. So come with me and let's travel back through the centuries to stack OG feudalism against this shiny new version to see if we might actually have it worse than our medieval ancestors. We'll eventually zoom out to the feudal system as a whole, but first let's discuss what feudalism meant for the individual peasant, because in the techno-feudalist future, that's you. Peasants who worked the land were called villeins, and they owed heavy labor to their lord, although they also farmed strips of their own land to feed their family. You see, medieval peasants were certainly exploited, nobody's arguing that, but they weren't entirely without resources or entirely without bargaining power. Most crucially, peasants enjoyed the use of the commons, which were shared rights to pasture their livestock, gather firewood, and forage on uncultivated lands. It doesn't sound like much to us now, but with the way things are going, pretty soon this will start seeming like a fair deal, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Even looking at the late Middle Ages, we can see that oppression had limits. The lords needed peasants, especially after the Black Death decimated the population in the mid-14th century. Believe me, the lords didn't want to treat the peasants better, and they did everything in their power to make sure it didn't happen. There was the Statute of Laborers in England in 1351, which tried to cap wages at pre-plague levels, and both France and the Holy Roman Empire tried to tighten seigneurial rights, which were feudal obligations owed by peasants. Interestingly, these efforts failed in Western Europe but succeeded in Eastern Europe, because in England and France and the Low Countries, alternative labor markets in cities combined with peasants' revolts and the relative ineffectiveness of trying to enforce these anti-worker laws slowly led to the dissolution of feudalism as we know it. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, smaller urban centers and stronger noble control, as well as economies based on exporting crops to the West, meant that it was much easier for the haves to continue exploiting the have-nots, in some cases even worse than before. So if we shift our focus to techno-feudalism, does this mean that some parts of the world might suffer more than others? Nope, because the entire world is digitally connected now, which means we'll all suffer equally. When you were a kid, you probably imagined the future to be full of flying cars and cities on the moon, but the reality is looking more like an online prison where everything is some form of advertisement. In this new techno-feudal system, all of the productive assets like data and algorithms and marketplaces are owned by the platform lords, and we are simply serfs renting access. Sounds pretty similar to medieval feudalism, except at least medieval serfs owned their tools and had at least a little bit of land they cultivated for themselves. You will own nothing and you'll be happy. Just like these peasants owed a portion of their harvest to their lord, you're technically paying a data tax. Every action you take online, every click or post or insane comment you leave on my videos is harvested as valuable data, which the platform lords then sell or use for profit. In the Middle Ages, the exploitation of peasants was obvious, but in this techno-feudalist paradigm, you're being subtly exploited at every turn while constantly being sold on the idea that you're not. Unlike the medieval commons, which provided shared resources outside of lordly control, the digital commons has been enclosed in this really weird way that isn't immediately apparent. If you look at social media or even just the digital landscape as a whole, there is no true public square or open commons, at least in the big platforms. If a creator or worker tries to leave a platform, like someone who drives Uber or Lyft or even sells on Etsy, they'll lose their livelihood and sometimes their community too, which most people would say, okay, well, get another job. But if we're moving towards a future where pretty much everything is digital, then maybe that eventually won't be an option. It's a lot like getting evicted from the only farmable land in the medieval countryside, which mutual obligation with your lord would theoretically protect you from as a peasant. Some modern scholars have said that these tech platforms already effectively operate digital serfdom because they extract value with data and fees, while we, the users, must abide by these confusing and ever-changing rules set by our unseen overlords. It's way too much power to be resting in the hands of so few people. We're wading into the territory of what you will and won't be free to do in the near future, and the concept of freedom in the medieval world wasn't quite what it is today, so it's worth touching on that. For most people living on the bottom rung of the feudal system, the concept of individual freedom was pretty limited, especially because the medieval mind conceived of something called an ordered universe. This basically meant that God made things the way he made them for a reason. If you were born a peasant, you were destined to be a peasant, and the best thing you could do is offer your labor up as a prayer, and that's kind of it. Weirdly enough, even though there was far less social mobility, this actually created a stronger sense of community. I'm not intending to glorify medieval poverty here, but it's worth discussing because community is exactly what your new techno-overlords want to take away. If you were a peasant, your identity was completely tied up with your village, the church, and local folk traditions. Obviously, Catholicism was the one binding element that sort of kept everybody together because pretty much everyone was a baptized member of the church, and that kind of spiritual community could cut across class divisions. Unlike so much religious practice today, at least in the United States, medieval life revolved around the celebration of the Mass, or fasting and feasting for certain saints' days, or coming together to party as a group for whatever festival was in season. Historian Barbara Tuchman writes that perhaps the most shocking thing for the modern mind to comprehend about the way our medieval ancestors lived is the complete lack of loneliness, because everything you did was communal and everyone pretty much lived on top of each other. You could also argue that this led to a lack of privacy, but the fact that so many children were conceived seems to point to people being able to find a way. If we want to go a bit further on this idea of medieval community, we can look at the Canterbury Tales, which mentions in the prologue that folk longed to go on pilgrimages in the springtime. As you probably know, pilgrimages were devotional journeys to a specific holy site, and they were open to all social classes. This meant groups of peasants could come together with a shared religious purpose and rely on each other to complete these long and dangerous journeys across the continent. All of this gave your average medieval person, whether they were a peasant or a noble, a true sense of belonging to something higher than the daily grind, although the daily grind could be pretty rough. One could say that in the Middle Ages, community was defined by the church and not the people, but this would be missing the point entirely. Sure, the framework was provided by the church, but what those communities actually looked like varied wildly across medieval Europe, flavored by individual cultural traditions and the enthusiasm of those who participated. These communities were organic and united by a higher purpose to both survive together and make sure their souls all made it to heaven. Compare that to now when we're promised limitless freedom online, but if you really think about it, how free do you actually feel? Internet communities were once organic, but now they're defined for you by your algorithm, which decides what you might like before you do. You're ushered into different groups you might never have wanted to join, simply because the platform you're on decided that's what you liked based on behavior you didn't even know you were exhibiting. Instead of being united by a common higher purpose, we kind of seem to be continuously divided by the whims of the algorithm, and despite the fact that the digital age promised us worldwide connection, I don't think it's crazy to say that a lot of us have never felt so alone. Not to venture too far into conspiracy territory here, but looking at medieval history, it wouldn't exactly be shocking to find out that this is intentional. England in the mid-15th century had never been more connected, and that was exactly the avenues that the Yorkists took to spread their propaganda. The more disunified a population is, the more easy they are to control, and ironically, the more connected they are, the easier it is to spread propaganda. You have access to more information in this moment right now than a medieval peasant would have in their entire lifetime, which is wonderful. But be careful how that access might be used against you. Finally, let's touch on the fragmented power systems of the Middle Ages, because it's probably one of the biggest historical misconceptions still floating around today. Despite the fact that in most of medieval Europe the king was at the top of the so-called feudal pyramid, political and economic power in reality was actually somewhat decentralized between kings, nobles, clergy, chartered towns, guilds. When you get down to it, there really wasn't one single entity that held absolute sway. So, if you were a peasant, you might answer to different authorities for different reasons, like your local lord might handle land duties, the church might handle spiritual matters like paying tithes or obeying canon law, and then the king would be the one you'd face for serious crimes or appeals. We'll take a look at Charlemagne because it's a running theme on this channel now to mention him at least once in every video, but there's a reason for that. He was the most influential ruler of the early Middle Ages. His royal edict of 802 describes imperial officers hearing complaints from any man claiming that injustice has been done to him, and if the local counts couldn't resolve it, they had to refer the case to Charlemagne's court. The key takeaway here is that even a commoner could technically seek the king's justice if their local lords or officials weren't able to get the job done. done. Fast forward 500 years to 1315, King Louis X of France urged all lords in an edict to follow his example of freeing serfs in exchange for payment because, according to the law of nature, each must be born free. The point I'm making isn't about the freeing of the serfs. I talked about that in a previous video, specifically about the feudal pyramid, but we can see from this example that Louis, this medieval king who our history teachers would tell us was all-powerful, actually needed cooperation from the lesser lords, so sovereignty was kind of fragmented. This prevented a total monopoly on power, something that became more and more of a reality of political life towards the end of the Middle Ages. You can probably see where I'm going with this for techno-feudalism. All of the power is concentrated in the hands of a few major tech companies, which is bad news for everyone. Yanis Varoufakis, the former finance minister of Greece, argues that capitalism as we know it is slowly morphing into feudalism in a digital guise, where tech companies function like modern feudal lords. The land of the digital landscape is owned not by local lords who know you and will hear your petitions, but instead by Google and Amazon and Meta. I know I'm stretching the medieval metaphor a bit here, but these companies are sort of building self-contained online ecosystems that are kind of similar to castles with walls and moats. They dictate who can participate and on what terms, even to the point they influence how we talk. Half of Gen Z now says slew or slide and unalive instead of suicide and kill, simply because the TikTok content filters told them to. This goes a lot farther than feudalism did, but the key comparison here is a few elites controlling resources that everybody else depends on. Of course, we still have our national political systems, but increasingly it looks like they're in bed with tech giants who influence legislation to benefit themselves, and with AI becoming more powerful and more intelligent, we're not too far away from massive threats to national security. What I'm trying to say here is that the overlords of these tech companies in a way already have more power than a president or a prime minister. They pretty much control knowledge, labor, and marketplaces, which is an unprecedented level of power that any medieval king would have envied. But let's land the plane here. I'm not saying that technology is bad, or that social media is inherently bad, or that we shouldn't use the internet. I think we just need to step back and realize what is happening so that history doesn't repeat itself. I've discussed this concept in previous videos, but we tend to think of history as linear, which usually means we don't put much stock into the wisdom of our ancestors. This is why so many disregard the medieval era as dark and ignorant. Those people lived 1,000 years ago, so therefore they must have been much stupider and less capable than we are. In reality, history is more like a cycle, and if we're not careful, it's possible to find ourselves right back in the position that we worked so hard as humans to escape. But what do you think? Does techno-feudalism sound worse than medieval feudalism, or is this all just clickbait? Let me know in the comments. As always, I'm John, this has been Medieval Mindset, and remember, the past isn't gone, it's simply waiting to be rediscovered.